I want to talk for a while about Dr. Albert Eillis. Dr. Albert Eillis was the person who really started, he was one of the main leaders of the cognitive therapy movement. And I always tell this little bit about him because I think it's important to know. He was reading a book by a philosopher a couple thousand years ago named Epictetus, who was a Stoic. And one of the sentences he read just kind of leaped out at him, and that sentence was, people are not bothered by things that happen, but by the views they take of them. That one sentence completely changed his entire strategy. He was, as he himself said, a practicing psychoanalyst, and he referred to that as back during the dead dark days when he was a practicing psychoanalyst. That changed everything. He was seeing people over and over and over about the same thing. He determined that he was asking the wrong questions. He was approaching people's problems from a wrong perspective. And that one idea that people are bothered not by the things that happen, not by events, as I call them, but by the views they take on them, by the way they look at it. Now, I say that because for the first few years that I did this, I simply followed his method. Over the years, I've come to modify that somewhat, and I'll talk a little about why I did that. I think of Isaiah Berlin's statement, the fox knows many things, the hedgehog knows one big thing. Now, how that ties in with what I want to say is this. What I do in what I call rational emotive training, I talk about a lot of different things. I talk about language, logic. I talk about words that are problem words. I talk about words that are important words. I talk about certain biblical passages. I talk about Confucius. I talk about various philosophers. I'm kind of all over the place. I sort of make a mosaic. I don't stay on one particular thing, so I guess that makes me the fox. The hedgehog knows one big thing. Albert Eillis focuses on rational, emotive behavior therapy, and although he changes his method of dealing with it, he never doesn't, he's always the psychologist. He doesn't quit being a psychologist, which that's okay. He also focuses on what he calls self-talk, which is one of those aspects of this that I never really ever get around to much because these groups change so much. I very seldom ever start out with more than half, end up with more than half the people that I start out with. But he talks about what he calls homework, and what he means by that is someone in the group will tell about something that happened, some event that they didn't handle well, but they don't mind talking about it. And what he asks them to do is to actually write down sentences, thus and so, thus and so, thus and so, as well as they can actually remember what happened. And then they go back through it and say, is this rational or irrational? Is this rational or irrational? And they flush out and point out the parts of it that are irrational. And the whole thing he focuses on is simply changing your thinking from irrational to rational. Now, that's the one big point that we agree on, that word rational. That's our common denominator. We have the same goal, but we have two different approaches to get there. We have, you might say, the same end, but our means of getting there is a little bit different. His is more focused, where I talk about a lot of different things and bring a lot of things, particularly language, into the picture. So that's the one difference between the way I do this and the way Albert Eillis did it. Now, I do want to talk a little about Albert Eillis himself. Eillis was, as I said, he had a PhD in psychology. He was born in September the 27th, 1913. He died in 07, so he was 95, I believe, 96 years old when he died. He lived a long life, and he became very well known. Aside from selling a lot of books, he accumulated a lot of accolades along the way. He had a lot of awards given to him, and at one time he was voted by the American Psychological Association. He was the third most popular, most important psychologist who ever lived. By the way, Sigmund Freud came in third, so he was second. He was actually considered more important in terms of what he did, what he developed, and how he did it, and the people he influenced. And even to this day, and there probably will be for many years to come, the Albert Eillis Institute, which is located in New York. So he was quite a person. Now, one difference between Eillis and the way I operate, he was very skeptical about religion. He did not want to talk about religion. In fact, he, I think, had a rather immature viewpoint about religion, where I focus on philosophy, religion or theology, sociology, and history. Those are my four corners. He focused basically on emotion and behavior and how to deal with that. So that's why I say he becomes the fox in Isaiah Berlin's analogy. The fox knows many things, or rather I become the fox. He becomes the hedgehog. The hedgehog knows one big thing. So Eillis is an important person, and I don't talk a lot about him, but I thought it might be kind of important to do that. Now, having said that, I want to go to some of what you might call Albert Ellis's philosophy, what he really focused on and how he came to think about that. One of his main points is that the human race suffers from two basic misconceptions, and one of them is that one must always do well. He deals with this a lot in all of his material, that one thinks they must always do well. So you do whatever it takes to do well. And in having that belief, you're not going to always do well, so you mess up a lot of things. You have a lot of irrational ideas. You get involved in a lot of things that don't make sense. You open up a lot of boxes that you shouldn't have opened up, and so forth. And the other thing is the belief that people must treat one kindly regardless. And he also makes a big point of that. And then he talks about the conditions that everything must be just so. So the other thing is the belief that people must treat everybody kindly, and that it just isn't right if somebody doesn't smile at you and say hello to you and how are you and so forth. But of course that's not ever going to happen. Everybody is, no matter how much you try, or no matter how good you are, or no matter how moral you are, everybody is not going to like you. Certainly not, everybody's not going to love you. It's not going to happen. And so that conditions have to be just so, or you're going to become depressed. He talks about that as three basic misconceptions that the human race suffers from. And then people upset themselves by what isn't and what isn't likely to be. One of his statements is that things cannot be other than they are, which is to say we need to focus on reality. One of the meanings, the ancient meanings of the word madness, is to deny reality. Just can't happen that way. It has to be some other way. And so you create your own little world to live in, you create your own reality and so forth. So people upset themselves about things that aren't and can't be. And then he says that we should accept people as they are, otherwise we fall victim to them. And that's a very true statement. If we accept other people as they are, says Eillis, then we free ourselves from them. We're no longer threatened by them. We don't have to explain anything. We simply accept them as they are. He uses the analogy of a dog. He says if you have a boss who's a screwball and you get mad about it, You might as well get mad at your dog because it barks, or because of somebody blowing a horn in a car, or any number of other things. It's just the way it's going to be. So he refers to the boss as being that kind of person. So if your boss is a jerk, he says, why should you expect him to act any other way other than a jerk? You can't change it. So you accept people as they are, and that frees you from them. This rational behavior therapy and what is kind of the ideal model for kind of the age that we live in, which is kind of turning away from what some would call the confessional age to a different kind of lifestyle, to try to accept people as they are. And I think to some extent in our society we've come a long way in that regard. We are much more able today, I think, than we were 30 or 40 years ago to accept people of all kinds, all types, all countries. We still have a long way to go, but I think we do a good deal better job than we used to. So that's some of his basic beliefs. I don't know if you could call it philosophy, but those are some of the things that he operates on. And then to focus in on one of Eillis's approaches is he has a little outline of what he calls how a thought becomes a problem. And I'm going to basically just read through this. Stage one is the event stage. Now, I use that term. He calls it activity. All events are basically neutral. Neither good, neither bad. Shakespeare even says that. But thinking makes it so. If the wind blows or if a tree falls, that's neither good or bad. It rained a lot this morning. That's neither good nor bad. Consequences could be good or bad, but the rain itself is neither good or bad. So we just have to accept the fact that events occur. Stage two is the belief stage, what he calls self-talk, what I call evaluation. How do we deal with it? Is the situation fair or unfair? If we deal with it as though it's unfair, then we're headed for a problem. Is the situation is happening to me? If we personalize it, then we're way down our road to making it even worse. We turn it in on ourselves. Not only is it rain, not only is this event happening, but it's happening to me. It's bothering me. I can't get rid of it. And then the next part of it is every situation is out of my control. The thing happened, it's neither good or bad, but if I personalize it, then I have to deal with it on those kind of terms. Then if it's out of my control, I get panicky. I've got a worse problem than I had. So how a thought becomes a problem goes through those kind of steps. Then stage three is the crisis stage. It happened. I personalized it. It's out of my control. And now I've got a real mess on my hands. Every situation and event is interpreted as a crisis rather than an interruption. Somebody backs into your car and you jump out and want to kill them. That's a problem. It's an interruption, but it's not a crisis. And so many times people do bad things, the so-called road rage business, by taking things, interpreting things as a crisis instead of it's an interruption. We are interrupted all the time. We need to understand the difference, and there is a big difference between a crisis and an interruption. And then the next problem, it escalates into just simply irrational self-talk. We begin to tell ourselves all kind of things that are impossible, don't even make sense, and we become completely out of control. The Greek word for that is akrasia. We lose control of ourselves, which means we lose control of our thinking. And we're right back to where Eillis and I both agree. Everything has to do with thinking. It's the thinking process that gets us into and out of problems. Then there's the resolution stage. You begin to, I use the term repent, the New Testament word, which means simply change of mind. It also means change your behavior, change your lifestyle, change your way of living. Repent. metanoia, repent, turn around and go the other way. You have to recognize what's happening. You finally come to your senses, as did the prodigal son. The verse says when he got into the pig pen and he began to think about things, he came to himself. That is, he had an insight. He figured it out, that this doesn't have to be this way. I can change this. I can make it better. And so he did. So you reroute, to use Eillis' word, you reroute your irrational self-talk into more rational self-talk. You look at your words. You write down sentences literally on a piece of paper, and you see where you're making mistakes. You go back and you rewrite that sentence. That's why he uses the term homework. Give you one quick example. I had a young man in one of my groups. It's been several years ago. He was in the reformatory, and he was doing his homework. And here's what happened. He had gotten out of prison. He had made parole, and he got out, got a pretty good job. He was living with his mother, so he didn't have to pay rent. And he came to a point where he did something he had wanted to do since he was 12 years old. He bought a brand new Corvette. And so the day after he bought it, he drove it up to the mall. And he parked and he got out and he just was admiring his Corvette. So he turned around to go into the mall and he heard a noise. It went kind of like bang, bang, crash. And he turned around and looked, and this, he described her as an old lady, backed into his door on the driver's side. And of course, you know what that might do to a Corvette. It kind of left a hole in it. Well, he became very angry. She just drove off. Apparently didn't even know she had backed into his car. So he jumped in his Corvette, and he followed her for what he said was about 6 miles until she turned down the street and then turned into her driveway. So he pulled into her driveway too. And he actually had his arm up against her throat and was drawing back his fist to hit her. And a neighbor ran over and interfered and called the police, and so that was the end of that story. So here he is, back in prison, charged now with violating his parole, charged now with attempted, well, I don't know if it's attempted murder, but assault on an elderly woman, and so forth. So, telling his story. So here was his homework. He was supposed to write down exactly what he was thinking. And I won't use all of his words, but the first sentence was, the damned old so-and-so lady can't drive. That was his first sentence. His second sentence was, old people shouldn't even be allowed to have a driver's license. His third sentence was, I can't believe she hit my car. And then he had about 5 sentences, but you get the point. So now we go through and we say, number one, the old so-and-so lady can't drive. How many think that was rational? Well, about half of them raised their hand. And then I say, well, okay, what's rational about it? How is that possibly rational? He said, well, she couldn't drive. I said, well, you just got through telling us that you followed her for 6 miles. So now either she could drive or you're not telling it straight. So then he kind of smiled and said, okay, well, she drives. Then I said, then your self-talk is wrong. So to make Eillis' point, his self-talk was irrational. So we put an I at the end of that sentence. Then we go to the next one. Old people shouldn't even be allowed to have a driver's license. Is that rational? Well, yes and no. If he really believes that, he can believe that if he wants to. But if the state of Kentucky says she can have a driver's license, that's none of his business whether or not she has a driver's license. So in that sense, it's irrational. Then the other one was, I can't believe she hit my car. How many think that's rational? Well, a few more hands went up. Well, what's rational about it? Nothing, because he's standing there looking at it. And he's saying, I can't believe. Of course he believed it. He wouldn't be mad if he didn't believe it. So you see, so you convert every one of those sentences now into rational sentences. The old lady hit my car. That's a fact. She has a driver's license. She meets the law. I believe she hit it. I mean, the only thing he could say is, one day at the mall, a lady backed into his car and he had to deal with it. No, now what should he have done? Well, first of all, call the police. Second of all, call the insurance agent. It's an interruption. He can still go to the mall, get done what he needs to do, and he has to have insurance, so the Corvette people are going to put a brand new door on his car. He dealt with it as though he were a crisis, and he ended up doing several more years in prison. So you see how you can put this to work and let it work for you when you do your homework correctly. Now, I don't do that a lot at Wayside because the groups are too big and they come and go. I just generally give an example of it as I'm doing right now. But in Eillis's world, the way he does his groups and the way he deals with his clients, that's the way he does it. He has them write down what happened, exactly word for word as they remember it, and then they talk about it. That's a good bit of what he does. Then, of course, my part of the resolution model gets into knowledge, understanding, sympathy, love, and helpfulness. I use the prophet Ezekiel from the Old Testament. There's a verse in the Old Testament, I'll quote from the King James Version. It says, "And I sat where they sat, and remained there astonished among them for 7 days." The Israelites had been taken captive to Babylon, right south of where Baghdad is. And there they were, and Ezekiel had to go with them. He was their pastor, their prophet, their preacher. He was part of it, but he didn't know what to do. He had no idea how to minister to those people. So he just simply walked around with them for, he said, 7 days. For a week, he did nothing but go around, talk to them, ask them this, ask them that, but he got to know them in a different way. That's empathy. He put himself in their place. He come to understand them because of empathy. Because of understanding, he came to love them in a different way. And out of love then grew helpfulness, insight. Only then could he become effective as their prophet again, as their pastor again. So how does a thought become a problem? It goes through these stages. It doesn't just all of a sudden. Now, it can happen in a hurry, but it goes through these stages. For the young man who had the Corvette, he went through every one of those stages in about 30 minutes or less in a way. But that's how Eillis deals with how a thought becomes a problem. And then I want to talk also about some of his, he has a list of what he calls just simply examples of irrational beliefs. And I use these a lot. I use some that I get from other places. Number one is fear of rejection. It is absolutely essential that I be liked and loved and respected by virtually everyone I meet. And of course that isn't going to happen. And one of the ways I explain this is not only is everybody not going to love me, a lot of people are not even going to like me. And on top of that, I'm be lucky if people will even put up with me in some cases. So that's an irrational belief, fear of rejection. Then fear of failure, a need for perfection. I've talked about this quite a bit. Can you be perfect? Well, yes, you can if you understand it in terms of the biblical understanding of perfection. If you think of perfection as flawless, then of course not, because it really doesn't mean anything. You wouldn't know how to even define the word. Perfect means complete. If you finish things, if you complete your recovery program, then you are perfect at that particular point. So, but you are going to fail. That's going to happen. There is no need to be fear of failure. You don't want to concentrate on the things you don't want to change. You need to concentrate on the things that you want to change. You don't want to play football to try to keep from losing. You want to play the ball game to try to win. Fairness. It's terrible and awful and catastrophic when things do not turn out the way I think they should. I should always be treated fairly and always equally. Spending the years I did working in corrections, I would like to have $1 for each time I've heard somebody say, that isn't fair, that isn't fair. Well, it isn't. Life is not fair. There's nowhere it says on the law books in the Bible or anywhere else that life is fair. It's not going to be fair. It's how you deal with what happens that counts. And then blame and punishment. If somebody does you wrong, you be sure you get even with them. Be sure you blame them appropriately and try to punish them for whatever happened. Just not more than an hour ago, I was talking about this business of getting even, and nobody gets even. All you do is play leapfrog. You have to learn how to forgive, and it's hard to do. But one thing that people need to remember, I remind people sometimes of Wayside Christian Mission. Okay, now I talk about a lot of other religions sometimes, but from the Christian point of view, and if you take the Lord's Prayer seriously, unless you forgive people, you don't get forgiven. That's serious business. You have to forgive if you're going to get forgiven. So don't try to pay people back. It doesn't work. And that's part of what Eillis is saying here. And then responsibility. I should become quite upset over other people's problems, conditions, and disturbances. If somebody over here is doing something I don't like, I should get real aggravated about that. And of course, Eillis would say, that's ridiculous, and we all know that. We just need to be reminded of it every now and then. Avoidance. It's easier to avoid most of life's difficulties and responsibilities than to face them and deal with them adequately. Well, avoidance doesn't work. One of my professors used to write words on the board in a way that was always fascinating to me. He would write void dance. You're dancing with yourself. You're not dancing with anybody. You're trying to have fun all by yourself. You can't avoid people. You can't avoid certain things. You can't avoid difficulties. And to try to do that, of course, is irrational. Dependence. I need someone to take care of me, someone I can depend on and rely upon when I get in trouble. Well, that is so, of course, irrational. It doesn't need a lot of explaining, but yet a lot of people think that way. We talk about that in the women's group sometime. How many of you are just so dependent upon your boyfriend or your husband or some male in your life that you think you have to do everything they say, or you have to conduct yourself exactly as they wish? You don't have to think that way. You may think you're dependent, but if you understand who you are in relation to your whole situation, you'll find out that that's irrational thinking. And then what he called rumination. The Latin word literally means chewing the cud. If something or someone becomes threatening or fearsome, I must become terribly occupied about it, upset and worried about it, and tell everybody in the world about it, talk about it all the time until people get up and leave and don't want to be around me anymore. It's fine to have friends. We need friends. Someone has said if you have one friend in this whole lifetime, you're lucky. And there's a lot of truth to that, because we find out a lot of times that people we thought were friends, they were acquaintances. And when going gets tough, it doesn't always come through that they're friends. But we don't want to drive crazy the friends and associates that we have by going over and over and over our problems. And then the other one is, the last one is what he calls the perfect solution idea. It's the idea of the perfect day. I remember I heard a correctional officer say one time to another correctional officer, this officer came to and said, I don't know what would have been going on, but he said, boy, this just isn't my day. And the other officer looked at him and he said, well, out of 365 days in the year and 6 billion people on the face of the earth, why should this be your day? And that kind of sunk into me. I remember that right on and on. I don't have a day. So there is no perfect solution. It doesn't have to be my day. I just need to do the best I can with what I have. And that's the meaning of the word flourish. There is no happiness nowhere in the Bible, nowhere in all the great philosophers and theologians throughout history tell you that you have a right to be happy. The word happy is a problem anyway. But you need to flourish. You need to grow. The word flourish comes from flower. You need to flower out. You need to bloom. You need to get a little better each day. And if you do that, you will finally complete this program and hopefully become a better person.